Hello and welcome to the 6 Plus show, a podcast for your wargaming and 40k needs. Hobby talk, tactics, tournament reports, lore and much more. We have it all. Please welcome your host for the evening, Tom.
Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, and Khans on bikes. There's an engine revving in the background as I say that, which is quite appropriate. To that 6 Plus show. I am your host, Tom. It is too warm to be inside discussing toys today. Should not be doing it, but I have my summer drink. I have a huge pint of Aperol Spritz, and I'm ready to enjoy myself. So let's meet the rest of the discussion panel for today. I'm joined by Chris. Say hello, Chris.
Hello, Chris.
Chris, what is new in your life?
Oh, so many things.
Mm-hmm.
Or in fact, very little, because I've not been doing any hobbying at all.
What?
I know. That's a lie. I've started painting some trees of the Sylvaneth variety.
Oh, exciting. Very exciting.
But working out how to paint with winter wood. That's the goal. But other than that, no. Obviously, Jamie and I went to Saffron Slam.
Yes, you did.
A couple of weekends ago, which was good fun. And we both went 3-2, finished 7th and 9th, I believe.
Yes, and you hit all the big boys, didn't you? You went into the Tyranids and
yeah, it was fun. So I took the Harlequins, beat Drakari, Eldari, then lost to Tyranids and Genestealer Cult, and then beat.
Oh, it's a sick build. That's interesting.
Yeah, no, it was a really interesting. That was the game where there was no objective near any terrain.
Yes, I remember that one.
That was an exciting challenge.
Good times.
But no, I lost. So the guys I lost to finished 1st and 4th, and the one I lost first to, it was a 91-90 game. I don't think I've ever had a.
You don't get games like that very often.
I've never lost with 90 points, let alone a 91.
It's nice when it can be that close, I think. Yeah.
And tactically, that was a really interesting experience because I couldn't kill anything, so just trying to play mission. That was a good learning opportunity. And then Jamie did well with his Grey Knights. Again, he lost to the Genestealer Cult and Tyranid guy, and he lost to Knights. But apparently his dice rolling was just insanely bad. He just couldn't make a save. Whereas I played Tyranids, when I played the Tyranids versus Genestealer Cult, I literally couldn't fail a 4-up invuln. It was just I just had to constantly apologise. I was just I'm really sorry for all of these saves I'm making.
Sometimes you can just feel it. You can just feel it coming.
It's fated sometimes.
Yeah, I have that with Drakari. I have runs where you're just every 6-up invuln is getting made today. I'm making every single one, or at least one of every 2, just enough to absolutely ruin all your output.
Yeah,
sounds like a game we had a few days ago, Tom.
Lee, how are you, Lee?
I'm good.
Tell everyone how you are.
I'm doing all right. Yeah. Been very much enjoying playing my Chaos Knights.
Yep.
They're fully built. I've played 3 games now.
Played any Handsome Devils with them lately?
No, not. Well, I played Mark Kirkham.
Mark Kirkham. Okay. Shout out to Mark Kirkham.
Shout out to Mark. I've played 3 games. I've lost horribly 3 times. It's going great in that sense. But you know what? It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It's very, very different to what I'm used to.
It is, isn't it?
It's nice to have things that can move more than 5 inches.
Yeah.
And it's just a completely different way of playing. So I'm really enjoying that. They're all built now. They're fully magnetized. Some of them are painted. So I'm just working on that now.
If you were going to give a sort of very, very brief summary of the play experience with the new book to any prospective Chaos Knights players or fans out there, how would you describe it? What's it like?
It's definitely tough. You don't have the resources to trade anymore. Luckily, I'm fairly used to that because most armies don't do that either. Yeah. But what you've got is if your opponent has lots of things that can put down vehicles, you're in for a really tough time. However, obviously your output is pretty good.
Yeah.
And you actually do have quite a lot of mission play because the little boys are obsec for 5 and you can make one big guy obsec for 10.
Yes.
I think that the difference is just sort of positioning is much harder. It's not as forgiving as you think you think it should be forgiving, but it's actually the opposite. And you know what, to be honest, there's a lot more layers to it than you would think.
I think that's what's cool
compare
about
that to the previous book, which was kind of like a pamphlet. This one's got a lot going on with it, so I'm enjoying it a lot. And what's great about it for me is that there's a lot less mental tax, or at least I hope there will be, because you're not moving around as much stuff. You've only got, in my list, I think I've got 9 models.
Yeah.
which is sort of roughly what your average chaos knights player is taking. So I'm really enjoying it.
Awesome. Yeah, I think when you did that all demon engines list for Scrivo Slam, that was sort of.
Do you think that sparked something for me?
I think that awoke something in you. You're like, what? Having 9 massive guys is great. Yeah. What a cool
the demon
way
engines
to play
were so terrible, though.
They were so bad.
Maybe this is my way of trying to make that work.
Yeah, absolutely. No,
old style Forge Fiend is not the one.
I think they're very cool Chaos Knights. I like them a lot. I think the raw power of it and the potential of it was pretty clear even from R1.
Yeah, the issue is I don't have a clue what I'm doing. So what I've been doing so far is sort of moving the bits around, trying to just remember where to be. Useful stratagems, resource management, and a couple of other bits that sort of you just learn only by doing. So I'm trying to just do as much as I can, and hopefully learn a few things.
Definitely. No, very exciting. Well, you've got to get ready and limbered up because we're going to a Teams event before too long.
They are a good candidate for the list
for that. We may well have you on the nights unless Chris has a panic and puts you on the Thousand Suns where you're safe, where you're reliable.
We'll see how this weekend goes. This is Lee's trial. I think it's got it in it.
Oh, God, I'm never... To be fair, when we played Thousand Suns vs Harlequins, I did win that, so I guess I'm up for that.
So if you lose this with Knights, then...
Yeah, scary.
I actually think that it's Knights have a really good game into Harlequins. I'm saying now, but watch me going on the podcast next week when it did not go this way. Just because it's not, there's a lot of hitting on sort of whatever's, depending if it's light or dark, but then there's a lot of winning on 2s. Yeah. A lot of mortal wound output in phases that are quite annoying. And just ways to sort of interact with morale that for some reason I think Harlequins will suffer with, because if you're at -3 and you're losing models on 1, 2s and 3s and you're losing 2 models for those, that's going to really, really hurt.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It probably won't work out that way because anything to do with morale is terrible.
No, it's not. It's the best feature of the entire game. Anything involving leadership.
So come back this time next week when I've lost 130 twice.
We'll do some video updates on the Facebook page.
Please do.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Although you'll have to forgive that they're not painted.
Yeah, that's why it's not going to be a bite-sized bat rep. We'll just do some little comment video type things for people who want to follow along.
Yeah, let's do that.
Very nice, very nice. I've not done much hobbying either because it is really nice outside in the UK, and I think everyone should seriously consider doing very, very little Warhammer and actually just getting out in the weather because it's fantastic. But I have painted some Drakari. I've been improving my Drakari army because my poor Drakari have always been rushed for every witch event over the last 2 years, and so many units are like nearly nice but could be much nicer.
You're doing that thing that I thought was impossible.
Yes.
Which is to go back and actually do the thing, which is update your models.
All it took was speed painting 2 armies for 2 different events in the space of about a month and a half, which made me so upset with the idea of painting something new that I've sort of retreated into security and things that are very reliable. But I'm having a lot of fun with that. I bought a bunch of like little crystals, like glowy green crystals for basing. So I was going to do this with Skaven, and indeed I am going to do this with Skaven for like Warpstone. But then I was like, I bet this would look nice on my Drakari. And indeed, it does. It's nice to have a bit more glowing green dotted around the bases. So I'm having a lot of fun with that. Sweet. Okay. Well, today we are going to talk about resources and resource management. Because this is something that we all feel is a really important aspect of 40k, and it's about to be even more important, guys, because they're about to change the way some of your resources function. We know that the game is about to update, and we know that with that, certain aspects of the game, particularly command points, are going to change. So we thought it was a good time to talk through our own experiences of resource management and talk through some of the common mistakes, common issues, common things and lessons that we have learned, perhaps, that help us to get the most out of our armies, our units, our resources. Because running out of resources in a war, I'm told, is not good. Not a good thing. So if you can avoid that, we're looking at you.
Everything in my power not to say that.
Not to name any countries. Don't run out of resources. And so it's very relevant. We're in tune with the zeitgeist with this episode. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about command points to begin with. Then we're going to think about what we've termed faction-specific resources, or FSRs. Let's say now I'll never use that again. Yes. I will literally never use that again. And then units, points, and characters. the sort of dual concepts of trading and overload, because this is a fun conversation, actually quite an interesting conversation about trading and bit piece exchanges versus flooding and the respective merits and advantages of doing both, YOLOing versus very measured and controlled play. So without further ado, we're gonna stray into the fabled realm of command points. Now, command points are changing. We know that. But we're going to talk primarily about the use of command points as we've had to deal with it in ninth so far and some of the key issues with that. So would either of you like to take the floor first to discuss some of the potential challenges, issues with command point management?
Yeah, I think it's maybe worth just quickly hopping on to what those changes are for those of you who haven't seen them.
Yeah.
So most of our competitive games are played at 2,000 points or a strike force size battle, which we're used to sort of basically starting with 12 CP, and then you're spending however many you want on other detachments, additional relics, warlord traits, whatever. And then you're used to getting one back in the command phase, the start of your command phase in every turn. And the way that's changing is that rather than doing that, you're going to start with 6 CP, and you're going to gain a command point back in each player's command phase. So obviously the timing of that is quite significant. And the other major change is that you also will no longer have your free relic and warlord trait. So if you are wanting at least one of those, you'll be actually starting with 4 CP in the game, although you'll quickly get one straight back. And obviously any additionals. So what you might find is rather than starting with sort of 7, 8, 9, 10, as sort of a typical list might be, you might be starting with 1 or 2, and that's a really significant difference.
Yeah, hugely different. And the gaining of 2 per turn, I think, will really change the way that especially late game plays happen, right? Because
how often have you I've done it before, rocked up to it, particularly with my Chaos Space Marines, you'd rock up to a table, something good would come about, but it's head out. Your Obliterators are double shooting, and they're getting Iron Warriors treatment, and they're getting +1 to wound, and then you're going to shoot twice. And then all of a sudden you've spent the sort of 6 CP in one go, and that's just not going to be a thing anymore.
No, exactly that. Yeah, the capacity to spend in massive bursts. Some armies will still manage it because there's lots of generation, and not all armies need traits and relics as much. And actually, we'll soon find out which armies needed them and which armies just had them because they were a nice thing to have. Right? I think they're more essential in some armies than others. But that's actually something we're going to discuss in more depth when we talk through Nephilim when it drops. In a week or two, and we'll do more of a deep dive on that and the implications of that later on. So in terms of command points, it's as you say there, Lee, I think they're a resource which can be very, very important at clutch moments in the game, right? A lot of armies want to sink 2, 3, 4 command points into particular actions. They can unlock some extremely game-changing moments, particularly some of the core command point abilities with interrupt, with pass morale, with re-roll on a big save at the clutch moment. All of these things can be game defining in terms of the points they can accrue you, the points they can save you, the damage they can do. So what do you think, and we'll head to Chris first, what do you think as a player we can do to ensure that we get the most from command points in our games and avoid having a situation where we're struggling resource-wise with our command point management?
Yes, I think fundamentally it's always been a good piece of advice, but now it's just almost essential if you want to compete well, is you need to have a plan for your command points before you go into the game. So you build your list, you need to know what are the key stratagems you're going to be using on turn kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to an extent. When all of our CP was front loaded, it could be more like a 1, 2, 3. I'm going to hit these combos and then job done. Now it's probably a bit more like evenly spread out. So have a plan. You look at your stratagems. How is my army designed to function on the table? How is it designed to win the mission? Is it one which is going to blow 4, 5, 6 CP early on these particular stratagems, or is it one where I can do like these little tricks across the course? But most armies, I think, have a few stratagems which they're going to use regularly. So I know that Harlequins players will often want Phantasm in their back pocket.
Oh yeah,
for that first like that opportunity to redeploy. But there are lots of armies out there. They have certain stratagems that they want, certain combos that they want. You need to have that planned out, because it means that when it comes to other opportunities to do your stratagems, you know whether you can afford it or not. So if you come up with a plan to say, right, I know over the course of this game, I'm going to need to spend these 6 CP, you'll be able to at any given moment go, oh, actually, I can afford this or not. So I think having a plan is going to be super key. Yeah. And I think it's so easy to just get into that situation where you're thinking, right, oh, I really want this unit to stay alive. If this unit stays alive, if I just make this 4-up invulnerable with this reroll, he'll then have to fire another thing into this unit to kill it, which means that unit over there might survive, and then that might change the course of the game. The amount of times that, first of all, you fail the 4-up. Roll 1 into the 1. We all know that's going to happen. Yeah. But the amount of times that doesn't actually affect how the game goes.
Yeah.
Vanguard Tactics love to say CPs for VPs, and it is, I mean, to an extent, it is kind of true. You know, you want to be using your command points to help you score. I can give one example of from a NIDS game I played recently, where I needed to make some 4-up invulnerables, and I've got my luck rolls. They didn't come off. I used my CP reroll to try and make that 4-up invulnerable, and I failed it. Now, the unit died, fair enough. They were probably going to die to a flyer anyway. But the thing was, by failing that save, it actually cost me 4 primary points because a unit was therefore not on the objective. And I lost the game by 1 point. So that was a situation where using a command point reroll scored me, in this case didn't, but could have scored me victory points. Yeah. Whereas at other points, you know, I've done it with my custodies so many times. You know, you use your CP to try and keep your custodies alive. They feel like they're really valuable. Yeah. And I think it's really easy just to get drawn into the heat of the moment. Mm-hmm. So I think you want to try and take that step back and go, you know, if this unit dies or doesn't die, like what impact is it going to have on the scoreboard, and is that changing the shape of the game? Yeah. So those are kind of the 2 things I'd say, you know, think about those rerolls. I mean, now rerolls are so valuable, you know, like you're getting, I mean, I think list building is going to change, you know, people aren't going to want to take 2 detachments anymore. They're going to be a lot more reserved on warlord traits and relics. And, you know, you can't front load your CP. You can't hit hard in big, you know, obliterator bursts because you're just going to be. But you are going to get stuff, you know, as it comes along. But that moment where you're like, oh yeah, but I'm already running really low on CP. Do I want to do this command point reroll? Yeah. So when we did that battle report where command point rerolls were 2 CP,
yeah, that was huge. And
all of a sudden you're like.
It was so interesting, wasn't it, having it like that? Because you're like, it's not worth it. It's absolutely not worth it. So we didn't do it at all.
But so often we're like, it's only 1 CP, might as well.
Yeah. Whereas now we don't have 5 turns.
Yeah, exactly. We don't have that luxury
reroll, right? Where you're just like, go on, let's chuck a bit more in. Let's get a bit more damage. Go on. I think it's an interesting point you make about like almost like blood rush, because I think that's a very real thing with command points. I think when in the heat of the game, is. In the heat of the game or the heat of like a big moment, whether you're on the defense or whether you're on the attack, I think there's a genuine adrenaline at work here. And actually, this is something, you know, the relationship between like psychology and chemicals and resources in general is quite an interesting one. Like, why do people gamble? Why do people blow money on this, that, and this? Why do people spend hundreds of pounds on chaos demons? All these kinds of unanswered questions. And I think with command points, sometimes you have to recognize exactly as you say, is the sort of expenditure here being driven by a management of outcomes in the game that's important? Like, are there points on the line? Is there primary on the line? Are there secondary points on the line? Okay, that's a good use of it then. If there aren't, or if I'm just trying to push through a bit of damage in a fairly inconsequential bit of shooting or melee, then that's not necessarily a good use for it, right? At the moment, there's so many times where I've had games and I've done it and my opponents have done it, where it's the end of your turn. And in some kind of exchange of attacks or combat, for whatever reason, you spend one CP that you don't need, and then you look down and you go, "Oh, it's their turn now, and I can't interrupt. I've gone down to 1 CP. Yeah. I've eaten my interrupt CP." And the 2 CP for interrupt is so huge in so many exchanges, and it's so easy when you're not paying attention to just blip it for some other little thing that you didn't necessarily need, that wasn't vital. And certainly isn't as vital as one of your big assets getting to smack something in their turn, right? Lee, do you want to come in on this too?
Yeah, I guess to go with that, there's two things. One small point, which you've alluded to, is using CP for things that are not gambles. So for instance, rather than, if you have the option for on a 4-up, something happens. There's a good example in the Chaos Knights book. So there's one of them is allow you reroll once to hit.
Yes.
Another one in combat. Another one is +1 to hit in combat. So reroll ones might never be useful. +1 to hit is much more likely to be useful. So I like things that give you a guaranteed effect.
Yeah.
But the main point I was going to make before that was actually to go along with what Chris was saying. Not only when you're sort of planning how you're going to use your CP, and you're sort of thinking, maybe I'll use that reroll or whatever. Also remember that your opponent is in the same situation as you.
Yes.
So they also have less CP. So the way that it should balance is that you both actually have the same reduction in resource. So the timing of it might be ever so slightly different than it used to be. Mm-hmm. But they also may be less likely to push you to that point anyway. So it's going to be a really interesting sort of mental joust to see who's going to use those resources when, because as I say, the timing of it is going to be so much harder to predict.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. And I think that earlier point about certainties versus gambling is really interesting as well, because you're absolutely right. I think different factions have stratagems that just consistently offer so much.
I'll give you another example from the book that I did one against you and I did the other against Mark. So 2 CP, a lot of CP, and it will be in the future. Auto explode a knight.
Yeah, and that's going to wreck.
That's going to be great, right? I mean, there is the 2d6 range on that, so you do run the risk that you get a 2-inch explosion.
But it's a shower of mortal wounds into tiny fragile bodies.
Kills Drazar in one go. That's good fun.
It did kill Drazar in one go. Go to hell.
But then similarly, that's a huge effect.
Yeah.
In the next game, I thought, well, I've done that already. I'm going to try something different. I'm going to try the strat that on a 4-up brings a knight back to life from the dead. 2 CP doesn't get up.
Oh, I knew it.
That's a kind of resource that in a sort of competitive environment you cannot rely on a 4-up to happen. And 2 CP for that on something that it has a 50% chance of being game changing, being game breaking potentially if you die in the fight phase and you come back and you've got a knight that you can use in the next round. Yeah, but it doesn't happen.
Sort of thing you do when you're down, isn't it? You're like,
if I've got no other options, then I will try it, because if it's the thing that keeps me in the game and it comes off, then I have a chance. And if I don't, then I'm losing anyway. So
that's that.
But you don't do that speculatively anymore. I don't think.
No, exactly. I think that touches on another point, which is that you can relate this to game state, can't you? There are situations in which you need to take some gambles. You need to try a couple of things, and then the flashier plays, or trying to get a character back up or a knight back up, all of these sorts of things, Phoenix Lord, whatever else. Those things can suddenly matter a lot more, because the potential reward might just be enough to help you get back in a game that you're getting out of. But wasting resources to no effect, essentially, when things are going well, isn't a good use of resources.
No. What's interesting, actually, is thinking about, I know soup is unfashionable, but we'll sort of bring it back in with knights now. One thing that's worth keeping in mind is if you can have any cross-faction synergy that actually reduces the probability risk on some of these things.
Nice.
So one example for that is obviously you can't CP that reroll, that stratagem that I just mentioned to bring your knight back to life. But if you're souping in a 1,000 Suns list, which I often would, you can also use your Infernal Master Pact, which is to reroll any dice. So then you've actually got a 75% chance of that coming off.
That's clever.
So it's worth thinking about it. It's niche. There probably are other areas that were like, especially with the old books, that would maybe allow you to do some weird stuff like that. But look for any synergies like that.
Yeah, no, that's a very nice one. And I think the other thing, Chris talked about having a CP game plan, and I think that's totally valid. I think you will know from a few goes around playing any army what your important stratagems are, right? You start to realize
what got a handful
what fun ones are and what the actually genuinely good ones are.
Yeah.
And I think eventually, certainly a lot of good players keep track of that. And a lot of good players are like, well, I want to use this stratagem 2 or 3 times in a game, so I have to make sure I have CP to do that. How many CP is that? That's 4 or 5. Okay, then I have to make sure that 4 or 5 of my CP are being kept specifically for that. I had an example. I played White Scars relatively recently, and it was an all-combat-y White Scars. And looking at the game, I was like, well, I'm going to want to interrupt every turn, because he doesn't have the means to engage me he doesn't have a fight last, doesn't have anything like that. So I can interrupt every turn. So actually I just need to save my CP and just kill his stuff in his turn every turn for the game. Mm-hmm. And that was a much better use of it than saying, oh, I'll lightning fast reflexes, I'll fire in fade. Other things that you might use in a different situation, a different kind of game, become irrelevant in this context.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
Yeah. So I think judging the opponent a little bit and judging the particular demands of the mission. Are you going to be needing to interrupt a lot? Are they coming at you? Is there going to be realistic scope to do that? Which of you, is it your defensive strategies you're going to need to lean on? Is it your offensive one? Are you going to them? Mm-hmm. Do you need movement? Do you need speed? Are they coming to you? Do you need reactions? Do you need just sort of trickery of movement and intervening, those sorts of things?
Yeah. I think one thing that I think Chris alluded to earlier is one thing we'll definitely have to be sort of revisiting is list design anyway, and particularly any army that has the function to get regeneration into their list.
Yes,
because if you can sort of leech an extra 1 a turn, that now could be absolutely game changing. If you need a 3 CP stratagem, if I look at my Thousand Suns to reduce sort of incoming damage on those Terminators from 3 to 2, that's an absolutely game changing thing.
Yeah,
and if you can then just sort of when your opponent uses strat or at the start of the battle round, you can roll a dice and you can get one.
Yeah,
I think that's something that you will start to see more and more people bring in.
Definitely.
And conversely, value of something like Agents of Vect or whichever assassin it is that increases CP costs suddenly becomes
Agents of Vect or
exponentially more
completely
valuable.
life-ruining tool as it now is. Yeah, it does make me wonder about 4-Armed Emperor for GSC as well, because I've never actually really run them, but actually...
But if you can just starve your opponent of CP, I mean, that is a viable way of trying to win a game.
Huge. Yeah, completely.
Absolutely it is.
It's strangling another resource, isn't it? I think one of the interesting, we alluded to it earlier, but the fact you'll be paying for every trait and every relic means that you will also need to very genuinely weigh up every warlord trait and every relic against stratagems, because ultimately they're coming out of the same pool. You're going to have to make decisions, and I think ultimately some armies will realize their warlord traits matter a lot less than others. I mean, the examples, so GSC warlord traits very rarely affect the game in any meaningful way. Most of your characters hide or die, and they're not going to be doing anything particularly glorious with their warlord traits. You contrast that to something like Harlequins, for example, where the warlord traits you tool up your troop master with, that's a massive part of how you play, right? You can leverage a lot of damage, a lot of output out of one little character, and you have to really look at every trait you're putting in there, every relic you're putting in there, and thinking, is there a stratagem out there in my book that actually is better to have that and have that more reliably across the game than to be tooling up these extra bits. I'm very guilty of buying every toy I can possibly buy, so this is going to be a whole new universe for me, because I like to load up every single trait and relic and thing that I can think of. And so it is going to be a real change. I suspect a lot of armies are going to go in with like 1 or 2 CP. I think that's probably what I'll do.
I think I will, oftentimes.
Definitely. Yeah. But as you say, regeneration tools as well, the means of getting additional command points through characters.
Some armies have it better than others.
They definitely do.
So then we'll start to see we'll learn very quickly how important, I guess, firstly that is, but also how important stratagems
mentioned, won't it? People on the internet will mention this. There will be mention of which
I think other people are going to talk about this.
Other people will talk about which armies have benefited more than others from the upcoming
Maybe we'll get some kind of list.
I'm not afraid to go
on a pyramid style.
A tier system.
Oh,
we've never done a tier system. I think we're probably due.
Should we do one? I think it's a very nice clickbaity thing for us to do.
Feels like a nice, easy 3 million views. Let's do it. 3 million views. Right, okay. Anything else to say about command points, or should we move on?
That was all the points I had down.
Wonderful.
Yeah, same.
Okay, no need to reroll. We will progress. We're now going to think about FSRs
falls off the tongue, doesn't it?
faction-specific resources, which is not a natural acronym and will not be back never again. And I mean, this can mean a lot of different things, right? But different armies have within their rule set, within their army's function, resources of different kinds that are themselves limited and do themselves require important thought and important use. Now, fortunately, I'm talking to 2 players who, in different ways, have used faction-specific resources a lot in their recent and past careers. So take us through it, Lee and Chris. Offer us some examples before I dive into some more general examples. What kind of faction-specific resources, or FSRs, do you use?
Well, with the Harlequins, we have this thing called Luck of the Laughing God.
Yes, you do.
And that's quite good because it's basically on average 5 free CP to reroll kind of every battle round, and that's quite tasty.
Yeah.
It's quite
CP
good.
without CP, that's what you've got.
Yeah, exactly. And it's you just feel so bad for your opponent when you're like, I'm going to reroll this one, and because it's 4-ups, if we were to live in a perfect world, you failed your 4-up, so your next dice is a successful 4-up, and it probably feels like that to your opponent. And I had multiple games at the weekend where I'd be like, fail, luck reroll, cool, pass, roll the next dice, fail, luck reroll, pass. And they must have just thought this was like ridiculously unfair. Because they're right, it was ridiculously unfair.
And then this time, also in 2 weeks, we'll talk about the Harlequins nerf.
Yeah, and they've taken that rule away. Hopefully not. And I think it just comes down to the same point I made with the CP, really, which is all about managing it and deciding what your plan is, rather than just being like, "Oh, I'm firing my Void Weavers. Oh, I think I might as well re-roll this one." You need to have a plan. Are you going to? Is it in this particular turn? Are you going all out attack and you want to cause as much damage as you can? In which case, you're going to use it for that thing. Or is it actually you're moving into position and you've given them 2 units to shoot at, or in a perfect world, only 1 unit to shoot at, and you're going to try and keep that unit alive, and you're not going to need your rerolls for anything else.
Yeah.
And so it's about linking your resources to your plan and having that plan. I mean, I'm not going to go into a game with the Harlequins and know, well, I know that when I play turn 4, I'm going to be wanting to use my my luck dice in an aggressive way. That's not going to happen. But it's a big thing about going first v second for the Harlequins anyway, having that resource. So that'll then help your decisions. But yeah, just linking it to what your plan is and adjusting that turn by turn. But don't just, it's the same with any sort of CP rerolls we've discussed, and that's essentially what this is.
But it's a smart example, right? Because it's a resource that, again, like CP, can be channeled either into offense or defense, and actually sometimes you need to identify when one is more important than the other. My short Harlequin career, I remember when in my game against Stuart, I basically had to go hunting for his Plague Burst Crawlers. They were his to the last, and a lot of the game was going to hinge on that. So I threw all my luck dice into channeling prismatic cannons into the Plague Burst Crawlers. So I just have to push as much damage through quickly on these to drop them as I possibly can. And I was relatively confident his ranged output wasn't enough to deal with it. So that was a moment where it made lots of sense to just get through the hardest bit about Death Guard, which is their resilience, right, and use it for that. But as you say, if you waste it on frivolous shooting that isn't important to the score or the outcome, then you don't have it when you need to make a bunch of saves later. And I've certainly watched Harlequins players do that.
No, I've definitely done it. There were times where I'd be like, oh, I want to try and keep both of these alive, but the second one's probably more important. But they start shooting to the first one, and you start to make some saves, and you'd fail some. You're like, oh, there's a chance I could survive here. You were never going to survive. No. There was no point. You should have saved all the luck for the important other one. But you can easily get kind of like lured into it by that. Fours be fours.
But you also want to finish a turn with any left over, right? That's
that's definitely happening. You're like, oh, god damn it.
Could have used those, yeah.
Yeah. So I think just as is going to be a theme here, I think having a plan of how to manage your resources and don't just try and do it as much off the hoof is kind of going to be the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. Lee, do you have any faction-specific resources?
Yeah, and you know what? As Chris was talking, then I realised how different they are.
Yes, they're so different.
They're so different. So the one that we're talking about, of course, is the Thousand Suns Cabal points. Interestingly, essentially they're linked to 2 resources. So firstly, you've got the Cabal points themselves, but also they're generated by a number of resources on the battlefield. So it's the amount of Cabal points you get is linked directly to the amount of psychers that you have on the battlefield. So they are sort of linked there. So there's 2 ways to sort of manage that. And that obviously each turn you're generating the number equivalent to how many psychers you've got and however many they're worth. They're different depending on how sort of exalted they are or whatever else. But these are very, very different to luck rerolls. In some ways, more powerful, and in some ways, definitely not. But what you get with them, and maybe this is why I like them so much, is a guaranteed result.
Yeah, maybe.
So what you're doing is when you almost all of them, there's only one that's not like this. They all do. They happen after the dice roll. And you are guaranteeing that something will happen. So be that more mortal wounds, more range, make something undeniable, cast at the minimum value. They all just happen, which is very, very powerful, in fact. But managing that again, especially if you're starting with a lot, and you do have to build it into your list design as well already to say, well, I know that if I'm running Duplicity, I'm going to need at least 7 to autocast the Duplicitous facade, Sorceress Facade. And that's a warp drive to 8, and there's a risk there that I just don't cast it, so I'm going to need that. But I'm probably also at a minimum wanting to make something undeniable. If my opponent's running a cycle, I'm just going to use that every single turn to either do some kind of interrogation or Wrath of or a Mutate Landscape or whatever that might be. So it really is a lot more about, okay, well, I know for sure I'm going to need a minimum, let's say, of 12. I know that I'm not going to have all of my cycles the entire game. So how do I plan to use that? Because I've done exactly what you mentioned there, Tom, which is to say, I just want to chuck an extra D3 mortal wounds onto that thing. I can probably kill it.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to go and autocast this power now. And then I'm like, great, okay. And now for my last power, my last trick, I'm going to make something undeniable. And all of a sudden I'm sort of 4 short. And I'm like, if I should have just done it the other way around, guaranteed that result, because that's what they're for, to make that more reliable. And so again, it's just like the accountant's way of doing a podcast, but it's about that planning. It is honestly every single turn thinking, well, what's the minimum I need to achieve with these? Yeah. Because what you've effectively got there is, I can't remember how many there are, probably 8, 10 or so different options you can do with them. Each one of those is as good as any stratagem in the book.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So I like to think of it in the same way as using CP, sort of a sort of CP that regenerate almost in full each turn, turn. And just making sure that you're sort of sensible with them. And sometimes you need the extra D3, which will inevitably be a 1 when you roll it. Yeah.
I think trying to run Thousand Suns without the Cabal points is like trying to drive a car without starting it in a way. It's kind of, it doesn't make any sense. And when you watch players who don't, like players who are inexperienced and don't fully understand the Cabal phase, Cabal points and their utility, and you go through 1,000 Sun cycles when you're playing against them, and you're just like, you're just missing out on truckloads of damage. You could be absolutely ruining me right now in the situation you're in, and you don't know the combo that you need. You don't know the 3 things, the 3 spends right now that would just open me completely up.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
And it's so important.
I think that there are players out there that sort of still like to do 1,000 Sun soup.
Yes,
Other than bringing a knight, there's no other way to preserve those. They're just so valuable.
They're so good.
I certainly don't leave home with sort of, and I guess that's a relevant point, as I'm always planning to have at least sort of 15, 16 on my list.
Yeah.
Just because I think that they are so valuable.
And I think it's another good point that how reliable they are compared to the lot dice. So the Harlequin play, you go in and you're like, oh, I've got my 5/4 up invulnerable rerolls. That's not 5 successful.
It's not as many as you think.
I've had multiple games where I have failed every single roll that I've got.
Yeah.
And whereas you've got that kind of that consistency and that reliability, and when mine go well, they can be kind of game changing in a certain moment. Either way, yours are just a consistent.
Yeah, you can plan for it. I think that's the difference. Yeah. I can go into a game if I'm playing another army with lots of characters in, and I think it doesn't matter if I'm playing Grey Knights. I'm still getting 15 on interrogation because I can make it so they can't deny me every single time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge consistency, and I think that what they may not be sort of performing right at the highest level, but I think they have all the tools to score really well in every game.
Definitely. And what I would say is, I wanted to come in and add to it because I think these particular rules layers are they obviously they vary massively in form, which is I think one of the coolest things about it. Right, if we think about the Drakari equivalent, it's power from pain, getting steadily better in different ways. Initially at fighting, then later at sticking around as the game goes on. Or you think about doctrines and the way that Space Marine armies in the final turn suddenly level up into these absolute murder machines if they're Blood Angels or Space Wolves or White Scars. What this whole rules layer is a 9th thing, right? It's a newish thing. I think it's often a thing that actually some players find too much, slightly more admin than they actually want to deal with. I think it's probably one of the elements that I think when they start trying to sell us buying all the same books again in about a year, what they will be saying is the game's got too complicated and we're going to help clean it up. And actually what we'll lose exactly this, right? We'll lose this extremely interesting, dynamic, faction-specific rules layer that brings out what I think, that's where the magic is in piloting an army well in 9th edition. It does mean a lot of bookkeeping. It does, as the recurring theme has been, it's management, it's planning. To use it well, you need to know you have it, and you need to know how to use it, and you have to think about it. But it's an enormously powerful and interesting thing, and I will certainly miss it when it's gone and we're all back to data sheets and everyone's happy because you can just turn up and smash into each other and it's all very straightforward again. But one of the things I was going to say was I think you need to recognize in some armies that your faction-specific resources get better over time, right? Thousand Suns, it's actually the opposite. Your resources dwindle. You're less good at it as time goes on. Harlequin's deliciously consistent. It's just as good at the end as it was at the start.
Although unpredictable, because you don't know how many you're going to get. Right?
That's exactly it. So with Harlequins, one of the built-in risks is if you gamble for too many dice, you get screwed, and every now and again you just don't have as many. But that's it. Harlequins are capricious. That's the point. It's supposed to reflect that, right? With Drakari, with Blood Angels, with White Scouts,
can I just say, what a great word.
Capricious. I love
that.
The
word. To call that out as a great word.
That is Harlequins. That is the way they play. That is the style. Chris is going to have some blowouts. Chris is going to have some glorious successes. That is the nature of Harlequins. They are a seat of your pants army. It will always be an adventure. But I think, so with the melee armies, for example, like Drakari, like Blood Angels, like the White Scouts, actually what those faction-specific resources mean is that you want to play for the late game a lot of the time. You actually don't want to run out of puff, not have units to benefit from all of these wonderful traits, right? There's no point having all of your assets dead before they have a 5-up invuln or before they're getting exploding 6s to hit. Sometimes the way your particular army is designed, and you need to look at it and think, what do these rules layers mean for how the army wants to play? Take like Cowion, for example, for Tau, right? Tau players have now noticed that Cowion exists because they lost Montcar. Cowion is a phenomenal tool designed to overlap with the way Tau have historically been designed to play, which is they are cautious and defensive for 2 or 3 turns, then they come out massively to finish the job in the final 2 turns. And Cowion is really well suited to doing that. So sometimes you need to recognize that I've got a set of faction traits or built-in bonuses that mean if I go out swinging straight away and everything gets killed, I'll never get to use half my units at their full capacity. Drakari, this is a massive thing, right? Drakari, you always want to take turn 1 off if you can. And actually the best opponents know they want to try and make you do stuff before you want to do it earlier in the game, because then your assets are actually weaker than they're going to be later on. So it's nice to be able to take your time and build up into the layers of rules and power that you have. I discussed this on our Faction 101. Go listen to that. I get right into this. Get all right up in this. And so, it varies army to army, but I think it's definitely a really relevant thing to try and work out and figure out what the army I love to play. When is it best? When is its added rules layer most effective? How do I make sure that I play the game in a way that means I actually get the most out of that ability? Because that's where the secret sauce is of the army. Cool. Anything else to say about faction-specific resources or FSRs? Go.
No, I think just to say that obviously that's not an exhaustive list. Lots of armies have things. Some are similar. So
Canticles, protocols.
The other one that's sort of most similar to what we've discussed would be the Sitter's Miracle Dice. Again,
Miracle
which
Dice,
can apply very consistent.
Oh, that's so good.
Strands of Fate as well. Yeah. Anything that can apply a consistent. I need to roll a 6. Oh, I didn't, but here's a 6 from earlier. Anything like that is just incredible.
I'm about to undertake a local Crusaders Oathway, and I'm just building the whole list to just be like 1,000,000 Strands of Fate dice. And just all my little traits and relics, just give me tons of them, and I'll just play around with that and see if I can actually figure it out, because I don't fully understand Craft Elder yet. I won't lie.
That was everything.
No, definitely, it's really relevant, and that's some armies have like Doctrines or Canticles. Once it's used for the first time, it's gone, right? So knowing when the right time is to use it, things like the Qatar, Martial Qatar,
the Necron Dynasty thingies,
the Necron Dynasty things, which are, you can tell they're the first one of these anyone ever came up with, because they're guarded, and all the rest are much better. But it's actually the exact same concept, just delivered better in every single book except the Necron one. Which has the single worst one that exists. Should we finish there? Is that the end?
Just turn it off. We're finished.
The end of podcast. Final ever episode.
So next up, we've got units, points, characters. And we're going to be going after that into trading and overload. But just in general, this is more about, I guess, your army as a resource, right? And how you manage that, how you use that. So let's get some Lee and Chris wisdoms on how you manage your respective armies as a resource. Take us through what the sorts of lessons you've learned doing that.
Well, I can tell you what I've learned in the last week or two. Which was playing the Chaos Which you don't have any resources, and if you trade poorly, you will run out of stuff very quickly.
Yes.
Anyone who knows me will know is that I'm a very cagey player anyway.
You are cagey.
I don't like to give things up, and yet I'm still losing an awful lot of stuff. So yeah, I think when it comes to army composition, it is where you can. It's about having things that you can afford to lose. Mm-hmm. Having resource that, if you're planning. Not for much longer, but if you're planning to take Stranglehold consistently, you need to have a number of fairly quick, objective secured, cheap units to try and do that with in an ideal world.
No, absolutely.
So I think when it comes to army composition, it's building that in, having units that will firstly die, and you have to get over that quite quickly. But actually have a specific function, as in standing somewhere doing an action and then dying, whatever that might be, and then not having to rely on your 450-point Terminators performing an R&D somewhere in the relevant late game.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So the relationship of units to secondaries is really interesting, right? It's a lot of secondaries are much better if you have just disposable cheap units to do them. Servitors or racks or mandrakes or something, rather than, as you say, really expensive units. This is actually one of the problems elite armies have in the game in general at the moment. Is the action economy punishes armies that don't have as many units to play with, right? So if you are an army with not many units, you need to have a very good, consistent game plan for actions if you want to use actions in your army. And indeed, some armies are good at this. So Blood Angels, for example, if you have a little 6-man jump pack unit, they can boop up and down in the sky, and you can use them to get actually a lot done.
Yeah.
Swooping Hawks, whilst bullshit and soon to be punished for being bullshit, I'm going to run a load of them in this crusade, are fantastic because they jump up, they jump down. And so sometimes one unit can do a whole load of jobs if you protect it and if you use it well. And this is actually very valid for when you're playing against an opponent as well, because sometimes you can spot
where is their resource.
The limb that you're like, if I kick that limb out, you're going to walk funny. And sometimes I remember my first game against Lee Churchwood in turn 1, all I did, the only move I made was 3 Reaver jet bikes, went over on one side and killed 10 cultists. And it was, for the game, huge, because that was his whole... That was R&D, that was that objective, that was that flank. They were going to do one R&D. They had the potential to teleport, do a second one later on in the game with Tide of Traitors. And I play Chaos, so I knew it was very valuable to kick that leg out early doors and make R&D a struggle for him, because then I'd rather have a 10-man Chaos Terminator unit doing it than 10 Chaos Cultists. What do you think, Chris?
I think it's really interesting because, at the face value, every single army has 2,000 points to create different trade or different pieces which are designed to win you the game. Yeah. And all the different armies do that in a different way. Mm-hmm. So you kind of, it's a different, that's why changing from army to army can be such an interesting challenge, because how one army uses its different tokens to try and win the game is completely different to others. Yeah. And that's what I've really noticed with the Harlequins. I think when you first start getting into Warhammer, it's kind of like, oh, that's big and scary. I'm going to go and kill that. I'm going to try and kill this. And we've all done it where, you'll be like, this unit kind of is, it might as well make its way towards the enemy. So I'll gradually move out towards the enemy. And actually, all you've done is you've moved it out and it's just going to get shot. Yeah. And I still do it. I played Jamie East the other day. I moved two bikes just out ready, so next turn they could launch themselves into the deployment zone. And absolute waste of time. He was always going to be able to get just enough of a line to kind of take them out, and it just was poor use of that particular piece. And I think playing Harlequins has made me really focus on using the bare minimum to compete or to complete the objectives that I'm trying to on a turn-by-turn basis. And if they're not achieving anything that turn, then what's the point in moving them?
Yes.
If they're safe for the time being. And Harlequins have that big advantage, as the Eldari do. They move really far. So you can be like, I can just get there. And certainly other armies need to progress in different ways.
Yeah.
But I think just knowing that about your army is incredibly important, and knowing how you're going to win the game and what pieces are going to do that. So, for example, in terms of my Harlequins, and it's the same with you, like with your Succubus and your Drakari, mine's my Troop Master. I've got this 100-point model who is going to go and do something really important and then die. And it's
he'll die. They never don't die. Yeah,
exactly. But how are you going to use that trait? So I've played 2 games into Tyranids, and both times my Troop Master's gone in and basically one-shot a Maliceptor. A Maliceptor is so good against Harlequins. So that is his role. And, don't get me wrong, I've always rolled well when that's happened and that sort of thing. But
so what you're saying is 100% of the time that's going to work for all of the listeners.
Yeah,
get a Troop Master. Doesn't even need a trait or a relic. Just yeet it at Maliceptor. Get in there. Harlequin's Blade. He'll get an extra attack.
Yeah.
Strength 3 AP1. Just fuck that guy up. You can use your Shuriken pistol.
Just the blade.
I'm not CP anymore, so you've got to do it that way.
But I think conversely, so in my mind, I'm like, it'd be really good if my 100-point model kills this Maliceptor, which is over 100 points. Or in the case of Tom, when we played and you had your Succubus, and as we said before, you got real unlucky.
She whiteyed big time, but it would have been great.
But she went into 10 Harlequin troops, which were a big force in my unit. And that's going to be a points trade up, but also, far more importantly, a game state trade up.
Yes.
So, for example, if I go into Thousand Suns, I know my 10-man troop can pretty much get really close to killing 10,000 Sun Scarab Cult Terminators. I know that because I've done it 4 times, and 4 times all 10 have
That's
died.
what's happened.
So that's how I know that happens. But actually, in the whole meaning of the game, you've got to think, well, actually,
I won that game.
Exactly. Is it going to win you the game? And sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. So in other situations, you might be, I'm going to put my 200-point unit into this 300-point unit, and I'm going to kill that 300-point unit. Great. But actually, that 200-point unit for you is far more valuable than just killing something.
Yeah.
It might be something that's going to do consistently score engage, or late game do an R&D, or just have that threat of attacking in the middle, like my 10-mans. They're there and they're hovering and they're saying, "Come on, just get slightly too close." And if that goes because you go and do something, like I played Jamie's Grey Knights and I fired mine in and they all punched up, and cool, I've killed loads of interceptors and stuff. But I now have nothing left once those 10 mans have died, and cool, I've killed some stuff, but it wasn't enough stuff, and now I've lost the game. So trying to just go, I'm going to punch up slightly isn't actually
it's a really obvious thing to try and do, which is, if I kill more points than my thing is worth, then I've succeeded. And sometimes that's true, but as you rightly say, it's so often it's not true, and it's just such an obvious trap. Because as those Terminators, whilst important to my game plan, weren't enough to swing the game. And you think on paper you sort of doubled your points worth there, and then probably got on to some other stuff. I can't quite remember what happened.
They died to multiple ones, but
and so I mean, in that matchup, for example, and against Thousand Tons Words, as you've got the interesting dynamic with elves, which is once you've gone in, you're gone, because they smite a couple of times and you're gone. And so my
dream scenario is you just directly in front of me.
That's it. The time to commit. I was like, I remember one game we played, Lee, where I think I literally just ran a Tantalus straight into your army.
I remember.
Literally just right down a flank.
It down my throat.
I'd only just painted the Tantalus up, and I was really excited. I was like, I'm going to fucking yeet it down.
And I think you'd done the shock prowl, whatever it was, and done nothing with that as well.
Yeah, it did nothing. Well, the Tantalus is actually quite good at fighting, but that's another day. The Tantalus will be back soon, everybody. I promise. But
yeah, that was the
sometimes
time
it's just
that
like
you traded something.
That was just so stupid. I think I killed like a chaos spawn, and then about 400 points of Tantalus went up in smoke. So sometimes that's the bad play. I mean, that's that's so bad that it's not really on the same level of any of the fine-tuned moves we've just been discussing. But yeah, committing resources and how many, again with Harlequins, it always comes down to, at the end of the day, you're if you toss up the number of actual wounds your army actually is, it is terrifying how few wounds
Yeah.
you have got on the table compared to almost all other armies you'd go into. And so that's an incredibly fine line. And in a game where wounds can get battered around in all sorts of different phases, you have to be so careful with how you use them and when you use them. So it sounds like you're learning a lot there.
They've probably got like 100 wounds or something.
It's horrifying. It'll be quite funny to do at some point. We'll add up some total wounds of some lists that we've got. Harlequins, it is horrifying how few they are.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's a really important point. And as you say, these missiles, these one and done commit characters, you've always got to be thinking about game state and whether that gains you something. As you say, that sending a succubus into that 10-man, that was a big moment. It made sense to use the succubus at that time, and although she didn't do a job, it was a decision I would make again. And as you say, taking out a Maleceptor, which the overall threat of that to your army is so substantial that it's probably as good a use as you can come up with for your troop master, right? I think in terms of resources, you've got to make sure that your assets are being used at crucial tasks rather than just convenient tasks. And I think another helpful thing to think about in that exact way in reverse is in your turn, when you're identifying the things you can kill of your opponents, it's a useful question to ask, to what extent is my opponent fully expecting me to kill these things? Is killing these things just part of my opponent's plan? Because a lot of the time it is. And so if killing it is part of their plan, how do I make sure it's not helping them or hurting me in some way? If they booped some Kroot hounds onto an objective, how do I get rid of this and sort this out without putting myself in a bad spot?
Yeah, they might be teasing you.
That's exactly
come and charge the Kroot hounds.
That's exactly it. There's a little bit of bait. There's a little bit of, you can kill this. Oh, there's this unit is exposed. I could get in and hurt that. Is that actually just about teasing out resources of mine? So I played against Craftwells the other day. I put one Talos. I had a single Talos as one of my units. I had put one Talos on the line, very tempting looking, and behind him, just out of reach, was a bunch of Kronos with flamers. And 10 striking Scorpions came in and absolutely battered that Talos. And then they all got battered to death by Kronos. And the striking Scorpions cost 200 points, the Talos cost 100. And it was very much like, this is exactly what I wanted from my Talos. He's done his job. And so you have to be very careful when you're identifying opportunities on the board and opportunities to use your units to try and identify, am I playing my opponent's game rather than my own here? And so taking out a Maleceptor with the Troop Master, for example, you are definitely not playing their game. They are not setting up, expecting or hoping that happens, right? You're definitely throwing their game plan off in a big way. But sometimes killing stuff is just playing into your opponent's hands if you do it in the wrong way and you overcommit.
Or if you undercommit and you fail to do that thing anyway.
Yes.
In the case of the succubus. Or
Don't
if
talk about the succubus
hadn't died, for instance.
Well,
You've got a wound or two.
The Troop Master, I mean, he's charged into 5 interceptors before and killed 2 of them.
Yeah.
And other times I've softened up a Maleceptor and then gone in and done 14 wounds. In this particular game, I charged in the bikes. All the bikes I think the Maleceptor had about 4 wounds left. Then the Troop Master went and basically one-shot the Maleceptor. So that actually was a situation where, I've now thrown away the bikes because the bikes are now going to die to firing from other things. Yeah. And actually the Troop Master would have done the job on its own. However, that Troop Master could quite easily, I could have just not rolled those 5s and 6s, and actually that Troop Master doesn't do the job. Troop Master dies, and I've lost it. Still got the bikes, but they're not in a great position.
That sounds a lot like your Abominant the other night, Lee, where we had the situation.
Exactly.
We had a situation, and this is where I think just experience comes into it, right? Which is knowing what happens when X hits Y.
Yeah. How durable is it really?
The more you know of that, and actually this is something I actually started doing a little while ago, which is very sad. Don't tell anyone I do this except the internet. But sometimes I'm like, I'll just roll the dice. I'll see what happens. I was like, what happens if I flame a bomb of Gene Stealer Colts, flames, 3 Void Weavers? That was the exercise I wanted to test. This was in the run up to teams. I was like, what happens if 15 hand flamers go at Void Weavers? I did it a couple of times, and I was like, even with luck rerolls, a lot of the time you're killing 2, possibly more. And I was like, that's probably, given at the time the salience, because this was a time when all the Void Weavers were always to the last and everything else. And I was like, as part of a wider plan where I'm dropping other stuff, that's probably a useful tool to have. And it did come up, and it did turn a game at one point during the teams event. It wasn't enough in a lot of games, but it was an interesting thing to have tested just to see broadly what the sorts of outcomes were. And so we had a game, didn't we, Lee, where your Knight Abominant, Mr. Never Die.
First, it's worth saying that he initially failed his Never Die psychic power.
He did.
And then re-rolled it into a perils. Let's start with that, because that's pretty funny.
Yeah, Lee had the worst luck ever in this game. But anyway, the Knight Abominant with the no re-rolls against stands in the middle in front of the army, and
we just we tested, don't we? Does an entire
we didn't really know. We were very curious, and so Lee fails the feel no pain, so I'm feeling quite good about it because he's just taken wounds off himself to no effect.
I think I took the full 3 as well.
You absolutely did. It was absolutely
unfortunate.
Brilliant. Yeah, so your luck was abominable in that game, and what happened in my turn was that in the end, it was a classic case of overcommitment, right? I chucked Incubi, I chucked Drazar, I chucked some Talos, and then 3 Kronos just one-shot him.
Yeah.
And the Kronos got lucky. They shouldn't be one-shotting a Knight Abominant. But what was very clear from that point onwards was that even I probably just needed Kronos and Talos. Stuff that was actually quite sticky and could actually deal with the punchback as well. Because what happened was Drazar got exploded, bunch of Incubi got exploded, and I lost 200 points worth of assets.
It was a really interesting
200 points worth of assets.
I was
it was huge.
And I exploded everything. I was like, this is all right.
Yeah, exactly. The explosion really it went from, oh God, Lee's having a horrible time, to, oh, Drazar and the Incubi have all melted. This sucks. And the overcommitment was massive there. It was a massive misuse on my part. And actually, with hindsight, knowing that the big knights explode the way they do, you've got to send stuff that can live through that, right? So Talos are great because they've got the feel no pain. You're not going to be killing any of them in an explosion anyway, but Drazar and Incubi are ideal candidates for getting melted.
Yes.
So it's, again, a lesson in that sense. Okay, nice. As our final point, this is an interesting theoretical thing. The sort of the resource balance between trading.
Oh, before we move, I have one more.
Yes,
I want to talk about the elephant in the room, the worst and simultaneously best resource that you can have as a Chaos player, summoning reserve points.
Oh my word! Okay, go on.
Anyone who knows me will know that I've been complaining about this for about 5 years now.
Yeah,
but sort of in the last 6 months to a year, I've actually started to enjoy it a little bit more. And I wrote down 3 points I just think are sort of worth having.
I'm so sorry that we didn't have a specific bit for summoning set out. I don't know. Yeah, come on.
Not many people are using it.
Lay it on us.
But for those, I guess, who aren't aware, you can keep some points in sort of not allocated in your army roster. And then if you have a Chaos character, you can summon demons in your movement phase aligned to any of the keywords that your character has, or if they don't have any keywords. So if you have a Zinch sorcerer, they can summon Pinchorus, let's say. There's a couple of interesting things around that. Firstly, and most importantly, you don't have to declare anything until the point of it happening. So what that means is you can summon in turn 4 and 5. That means that you can bring in things that your opponent, they can't target what they can't get to. And then you can bring in more resource when they should be running out of resource. So when you're looking to, say, steal an objective, or if you are looking to bring in a little bit more damage or whatever, and I guess that's one of the benefits as well as the versatility. You can bring in whatever you want, assuming you've got enough points left to do it. There is a lot of value in that, and particularly if you it sounds really silly because it's not very far at all. If you have a really slow army like My Thousand Suns, where your characters are sort of moving 6 and you might advance 3, when you summon, you have to summon something within 12 inches of you, so you actually can use that to have something 12 inches away. Now, that's no guarantee if you only move 6 and you're trying to roll an advance of that far. So if you just want to put a squad of Brimstone Horrors on an objective that's 11 inches away, that's much easier than trying to roll a 5 on your advance to get your character there.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing I guess I wanted to say is, whilst you can bring in whatever you need at the time. So if you can bring in some Flamers, for instance, if your opponent has lots of things that are going to charge at you. You can bring in some Fiends if you need something to not be able to fall back. There's a lot of value in that.
Yeah.
But also, your opponent has absolutely no idea what you're going to do.
They don't.
And there's always a lot of value in doing something they're not expecting.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, if I'm playing my Chaos Knights and I decide I really need to really double down on leadership debuffs, I bring in some Furies, I bring in some Fiends, and all of a sudden those sort of extra effects are coming in that sort of people weren't expecting. And people just aren't tooled up for it. They're not ready for sort of anything to come in turn 5, let alone in turn 4.
Yeah.
And it's just another resource you can use to actually get you points late in the game.
Yeah, and the sheer flexibility with that is awesome, especially if you've got like a black box of units and no one has a clue.
I do normally.
No one knows what could come out of there. It's quite amazing.
Well, just so much in there.
I remember
it could be any
Franco had an era where it would always be like 9 beasts of Nurgle coming out of there and sitting between his Psykers and the enemy. Yeah, and exactly. And so, but again, if you don't know that's coming, your whole game plan is completely different, right? And that's one of those lovely resources where you can just have so much more reaction. I really hope they get summoning right in the next book.
I've only just started to enjoy it, so they'll definitely change it now.
I hope it doesn't go away, and I hope that they make it an interesting and dynamic thing that armies outside of demons can still use to some extent, because it is cool. It is very cool.
But I couldn't move on without bringing that up.
No, it's very relevant, and it speaks to a lot of the same things. And once again, the lesson here, Lee, was don't just randomly summon things for fun, but do have some sense of a plan for your assets, right?
It's both having the right units for it, but also you have to plan a couple of options, really, because you have to keep the right amount of points behind. So if I'm thinking, I can't remember what they are now, 20 points for a Flamer, so I want to bring 100 points in for a Flamer, but I actually also want to have the option for 3 Fiends. Well, that's 120 points. Yeah. So it's sort of saying, well, am I willing to only bring in 2 and have 20 points I can't use for anything?
Yeah.
You have to sort of go through a lot of things, and for me, 75 points is the magic number.
Nice. Very, very nice. Great. Okay, so finally we'll come to this trading versus overload, which I think is very relevant, actually, especially in our current meta, because actually I think this is massively important. But in terms of resource management, as I see it, and I'm going to lead on this one, and I'm going to invite you guys to think about it. You get lists which are built very much around conservative play and using resources in a very measured and very careful way across a game and not giving too much away. But another game plan which you see employed and which occasionally in certain matchups becomes necessary is more of an overload style approach, right? Which is where you put the vast majority of your assets on the line very early in order to A, control space, and B, get into the opponent very quickly, because sometimes the calculus is that if I just go, you go with this army, I will run out of stuff before they do. And this is where I think resource management is a really interesting one, because you have to have a very keen sense of what your opponent's assets and capabilities are, and also what yours are, because sometimes the right thing is to go and sometimes the right thing is not to go, and it really does vary massively depending on what you're playing and depending on matchup. But I guess I was curious, have you had experiences like this in games? Have you experienced this kind of sit back versus overload kind of binary, and how do you go about navigating that, dealing A, with it when it's done to you, and B, do you have that built into your own plans at all as well?
I think there are some armies where it's just kind of like obvious. So, you take your monster mash, your demons.
That one does come to mind,
Yeah, you're going to be like, well, I'm going to throw all these horrible close combat monsters at you, and I don't think you can kill them quickly enough.
Yeah.
So I think you kind of want to have that idea, but then it's 100% all about practice. Yeah. And I think what a good thing to do is, and I've tried it a little bit with the Harlequins, like in our first game, Tom, just throw everything at the enemy, because you need to find out roughly, how easy is it for Starweave to kill Starweaves? I know I spent the whole weekend people complaining how hard was it to kill a toughness 5, 6-win Starweaver. But they are quite annoying to kill. Like, you have to overcommit, and people aren't used to that.
No.
The only way you learn these sorts of things is just by doing the most extreme. So just give and if Harlequins were more killy in combat, you could absolutely just throw all of your Starweavers at your opponent. And just say, well, I'm going to be in your lines next turn because I'm so quick. Yeah. And I don't think you're going to kill me quickly enough. No. And you would then find that out. I think if you want to successfully be able to run a list which is about overloading, you need to know how durable your stuff is, but also you need to understand your opponent's output.
Yes, you do.
I know, like, so for example, I played my Custodes at the team tournament. I played it into like an Admech and Knights list. I was like, he's got all those, he's got the scary Knights, and you fire them, and what I quickly worked out was actually these Knights were barely scratching the surface of the Custodes, and that was just through experiencing it. So I think, in an ideal world, you'll have time to do kind of like the maths and, understand that, but just playing matchups regularly and knowing how it will go. But if you're running Be'lakor and 3 Keeper of Secrets and a Bloodthirster because you're a nutter, for example, if you go and launch that into the face, you've got to be thinking, well, what parts of his army can deal with me, and where can I position myself so they won't get that opportunity to deal with me as efficiently. So I think in terms of overloading, you need to be aware of your defensive capabilities and also your opponent's capabilities. And then the other thing I would say in terms of trading is you want, where possible, you want to try and have just those throwaway units. I mean, the absolute classic is Stranglehold, may it rest in peace. It's about to leave us forever. But that you get first turn, I just need to put something on that middle objective. For a lot of armies, it is not that great to have to whack, Custodes, for example. I'll whack my 150, 200 point unit on there. You really don't want to do that. It's why in my Harlequins list I had just 4 bikes, and 2 bikes. Because turn 1, whilst everything moved into position in hiding, those 2 bikes would just go and sit there, and it was always going to die.
That's still like a 90-point unit for it, but you've got to do what you've got to do, right?
It does the job. It does the job.
It does,
sometimes it could really annoy people who actually... I think I had one game against Tyranids and he failed to kill a single one because he just underestimated how much it would take. And I'm sure when we see these new secondaries, there'll be stuff still to kind of deal with. There'll be secondaries where we need throwaway units.
Oh, definitely,
for sure.
And, I think that's a trading thing. In the Harlequins, it's all about what's the minimum I can score my points with.
I can literally see like a chaos. I can see a chaos spawn in my head. Like so many games where one little chaos spawn boops out. Actually, the beasts for Drukhari are quite good in the same way. If you literally just like a razorwing flock or something, some very cheap, tiny little thing just boops out and does that job. But as you say, having those assets built into your plan means that you don't lose more expensive things playing that game.
And I've done that. So when I've been playing with the Knights lately, there's no option. The cheapest unit you've got is 145 points.
Yeah, as a War Dog. I do. It's just when we talk about your Knights, I wonder whether you might want to put your Overload hat on a little bit, because I wonder what happens if 5 of the big boys hit you at once. I think that's a lot. Like,
I'm whilst it does exist. What I'm thinking of doing is having 45 points in there for summoning.
Yeah, well, that's a very smart play, and you absolutely can do that. I think that's very smart. But
just chuck in some Furies or something that's quick and annoying.
As you say, your opponent's output is important, Chris. I think also your opponent's function is important as well, right? So the way that a particular army dishes out damage. So the example I think is Craftworld, Eldar, but to a lesser extent Tau, where both armies are really good if you let them just line up a target and put all the right buffs and debuffs on it and then just blow it to hell, right? But they are much less good when given a ton of problems at once, which is why the meta's been quite interesting for them, because in many ways they are both armies that are really well suited to the standoffish tradey game, because they can just whittle you away. I put Guide, I put Doom, my army kills whatever it looks at that has those 2 things slapped on, and I do it rinse and repeat, right? Whereas actually, if you rush and get into those units and stop them all being able to sync up on bigger targets, the game plan falls apart. Craftworlds are, whilst good, they're a real house of cards of an army. So sometimes the overload is really worth it because it stops it getting to do its game. Tau are a tricky one because it's not. They're hard work even if you do get into them, and they're not easy to kill. But they both feel like armies where certainly with certain armies I play, it's felt like the need to actually get stuck in has meant I've had to adopt a more assertive approach with some armies to get in there.
Contrary to all those points, as I've already alluded to, I'm not a very aggressive player.
No.
What's interesting for me is being on the receiving end of that. So, as I've always mentioned, I quite like it when aggressive armies come onto me and they sort of they play in my third. I'm very good at putting down models that come into that range, which is great. However, firstly, not all armies want to do that. Some, as you just mentioned, are happy to sit in their third, and they're much better at that than I am.
That's exactly
so
it.
That's something you have to recognize is when do I need to switch gear?
Yes.
And to be honest, not something I'm good at. So it's something that sort of I am working on. But by doing that, you get this overly defensive mindset, and then actually you realize that sort of turn 3, you think, oh God, I've got not enough time now to do that, to get to the places that I need to get to in order to actually win this game, despite maybe having more than enough resources to do it. I've actually lost time just by being sort of either too scared of the potential overload, or sort of failing to recognize how the army properly operates, and therefore sort of playing defensively anyway. So I think that's on the other side of the coin, how you can sort of try and recognize what your opponent's doing, and respond accordingly. Don't just sit back because that's what they want you to do, because then even if they don't get to you, they get the entire board. So
no, completely. And it's worth saying, as you say, overloading done wrong or done at the wrong time can also be game ending. So that's the flip side. You give all those assets away. It was like they had there was the really infamous game last year where I think it was Sean Naden basically got completely tabled in a turn by like an orc speedwar, because he was elves. He just had to go all in. It didn't line up well enough, and the whole army just got gunned off the table. Sometimes it goes that way.
That's the way she goes.
And obviously, if you're trying to stay in a game and eke out points and be in the game all the way to the end, then overloading is fraught with risk that you lose the ability.
It's definitely a do or die strategy.
It's a very hard. Knowing when to weigh that up and when to go and when to stay is a really tricky one. I mean, armies like Blood Angels, for example, are all about this, because actually, if they get the overload right, they just crush you. But if they get it wrong, everything is dead. And so they really live or die by timing that right and playing cover and playing the moment to go right. But at the same time, they're not an army that just wants to send one unit all game. They want to have a moment where like 5 of their jump pack units get into 5 things and just batter them, because that's when the game swings. So again, it's different types of army, different types of things. But I think it's a really interesting, because trading has definitely become very salient, has become very hot topic. I think because of the risks involved and because it can go wrong and because it's harder to know when it's the right move, I think we're less good at working overloading into our conversation about armies and about resource. But certainly it's a very viable and very popular strategy that you do encounter out there alongside the more measured stuff. Wonderful. Does anyone have anything else important to add? Any pearls of wisdom? I'm just going to say FSR one more time.
Nothing from me. Chris looks like he's got an incredible point to make.
Yeah, go on, Chris.
I was going to say we've smashed it. I'm pretty sure we've completed Warhammer.
Oh, good. No, okay, well, he's an incredibly good point.
I don't think I'm ever going to lose again. I've just got a feeling. I think that's
no listener will ever lose.
Well, yeah, exactly. Now
please write to us if you ever lose, because
if you lose,
Chris will take full responsibility.
We will accept the blame. You will never lose at Warhammer again. Warhammer is going to stay exactly the way you now understand it forever. And you are not going to have to rethink anything in the next 2 to 3 weeks.
We've done the thinking for you.
The units you love will continue to be good. The armies you love will continue to be good.
Rules don't change. Points stay the same.
Exactly as it currently is, with no prospect of any kind of chaos, instability, or turbulence.
So see you in 2 weeks, guys.
Yeah, we'll see you in 2 weeks as we sail into the placid, never-changing 40k landscape together as one. We have been the Plus. We have had a very good time, and we will see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.